On the snow-covered plains of Yellowstone National Park live the most genetically intact bison left on Earth. For decades, scientists have called them the purest wild bison in existence. It's 100.7% pure and entirely untouched by the cattle ranching that reshaped the rest of the species. They were considered the absolute crown jewel of American conservation. At least, that is what everyone believed. Because in the spring of 2022, a team of geneticists ran a DNA test on those exact animals. They expected this test to be a mere formality, a way to confirm what the whole scientific field already knew. Instead, what they found quietly rewrote the genetic history of an entire species. And the craziest part is that it all traced back to just 23 bison that, by every reasonable measure, should never have survived at all. If you think you know the story of the American buffalo, you don't. Today, we are uncovering how the very act of saving a species from extinction permanently rewired its DNA, and why everything we thought we knew about genetic purity has been turned completely upside down. To understand the bombshell discovery of 2022, we have to travel back to the Great Plains in 1873. Imagine a single herd of bison stretching farther than the human eye can follow. It was a dark river of animals moving across grassland that ran unbroken to the horizon. Somewhere between 30 and 60 million of them once covered North America. They literally shaped the prairie itself. Their hooves broke and turned the soil. Their grazing decided exactly which plants lived and which died. Entire nations of people built their economies, their food, and their faith around these herds. And then, in the span of a single human lifetime, they were almost entirely erased.
This wasn't slow, and it wasn't an accident.
The destruction of the American bison remains one of the fastest collapses of a large animal anywhere in recorded history. Commercial outfits stripped hides by the millions and shipped them east by the railcar. Passengers fired rifles from open train windows just for sport, leaving the bodies to rot where they fell. Military leaders explicitly understood that wiping out the herds meant breaking the plains tribes who depended on them, so they let the slaughter run wild. By the late 1880s, the numbers turned almost unbelievable, from tens of millions down to a few hundred. One careful survey put the number of wild bison left alive in the entire United States at exactly 541. Think about that. 541 animals left to carry a species that had once darkened the horizon all the way from Texas to Canada. Scientists today describe this terrifying moment as a genetic bottleneck. It was a reduction of more than 99% that came within a hair of ending the species outright. And here is the part you need to remember, because it becomes the core of our mystery later. Every bison alive today, all roughly 500,000 of them, traces back to that tiny remnant. The entire genetic raw material of the species was squeezed down into those few hundred survivors. Whatever those survivors happened to carry in their blood, the future would inherit. The most isolated survivors of all were hidden high up in the mountains of Yellowstone. But by 1902, even Yellowstone wasn't safe anymore. Poachers slipped into the park's backcountry and shot the last wild bison for their heads, which they could sell to private collectors for more than most working men earned in a whole year. When rangers finally took a hard count of what remained in those central valleys, the number stopped them cold. Roughly 23. That is it. 23 animals descended from a population that had grazed those high valleys for thousands of years, now small enough that they could stand together inside a single fenced pasture. The men running the park knew they were looking at a catastrophe. A herd that small doesn't just risk being shot out of existence. It risks collapsing from the inside. Inbreeding hollows out a bloodline, one generation at a time, weakening calves until the line simply ends.
They needed fresh animals fast, so in 1902, they made a decision that would shape the species for the next 120 years. They decided to rebuild the Yellowstone herd by bringing in bison from outside the park.
But there was a massive obstacle. Almost nowhere else on the continent had any bison left to give. Now, the history books usually credit Washington and high-profile figures. For instance, in 1886, a Smithsonian taxidermist named William Temple Hornaday, traveled west to collect bison specimens, assuming the animal would soon be extinct and only worth preserving behind glass. Horrified by what he saw, he spent the rest of his life trying to save living ones, eventually helping found the American Bison Society in 1905 with President Theodore Roosevelt. In 1908, Roosevelt even established the National Bison Range on tribal land in Montana. But saving a species on paper is one thing. Finding actual, breathing animals is another. For that, the government had to turn to the real unsung heroes of this story, native and frontier families who had been doing the work quietly, with no government help. In 1873, a Pend Oreille man known as Walking Coyote crossed the Continental Divide with 4 to 7 orphaned bison calves whose mothers were killed in a plains hunt. By 1884, his small herd grew to 13. He sold them to Michel Pablo and Charles Allard, 2 ranchers of mixed native and European heritage, on the Flathead Reservation. In 1893, Pablo and Allard expanded further, buying dozens of bison from frontier rancher Buffalo Jones. Meanwhile, down in the Texas Panhandle, rancher Charles Goodnight built his own herd from survivors his wife urged him to protect. Between them, these private citizens were holding a meaningful share of the entire species in their pastures. But they had absolutely no idea that buried in those bloodlines was a detail that wouldn't surface for another 120 years. In 1902, Yellowstone bought exactly 21 bison from these private owners. 18 females came from the Pablo Allard herd in Montana, and 3 bulls came from the Goodnight herd in Texas. They shipped them in by rail to the Lamar Valley. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Let these 21 outsiders breed with the 23 indigenous survivors, fold the 2 groups together, and grow a single wild herd from the combined bloodlines. And it worked. The herd took hold and began to grow. The crisis seemed to pass. But that calm is exactly what hid the problem. Remember how I mentioned that Pablo and Allard bought bison from Buffalo Jones? Well, to understand what was secretly riding inside the DNA of those Montana and Texas animals, you have to know what ranchers across the West had been experimenting with. During the beef shortages, breeders tried crossing domestic cattle with bison, hoping to build a hardier animal with more meat. They called the result Catalo. The experiment was mostly a failure, and ranchers abandoned the idea. But abandoning the breeding program did not undo the breeding. Some of those crossbred animals and their descendants stayed quietly hidden inside the private herds. The exact same herds the entire species would later be rebuilt from. This almost played out completely differently for the United States. Michel Pablo actually offered to sell his massive herd to the U.S. government for $250 a head. Washington countered with an insulting $25, eventually creeping up to $75.
Insulted! Pablo walked away and sold over 700 animals to the government of Canada instead, shipping them over 1,000 miles north to Alberta, starting in 1907.
Fast forward past the 20th century, the bison had been hauled back from nothing. By 2022, the Yellowstone herd had grown into the thousands, with counts near 5,400. For decades, researchers tracked 2 distinct ancestral lines in the maternal DNA, a line descending directly from the 23 indigenous survivors, and a line carrying the signature of the northern Montana stock brought in to save them. Yellowstone was heavily guarded and fenced off from cattle because it was universally agreed that this was the last truly pure bison genome left on Earth. That was the assumption geneticist James Dare of Texas A&M University set out to confirm in the spring of 2022. Dare and his team, including Sam Stroop and Brian Davis, did something unprecedented. They sequenced the full genomes of bison from every major historical lineage and lined them up against the genomes of 1,842 domestic cattle. They were hunting for tiny fragments of DNA that didn't belong. They expected to find cattle DNA in commercial herds, but what nobody expected was where else it appeared. Every single bison genome the team analyzed carried identifiable regions of cattle DNA. Every one.
The cattle signature turned up in herds that previous genetic studies had specifically cleared, including Elk Island in Canada and, yes, Yellowstone National Park. The most protected bison on Earth carried cattle DNA. The amounts were tiny. Across introgressed bison, the levels ran between 0.56% and 1.8%. One Yellowstone animal came back at just 0.24% cattle ancestry. For 100 years, this signal had hidden beneath the resolution of every test. But it was real. To put that into perspective, the 0.24% of cattle DNA in a Yellowstone bison is smaller than the share of Neanderthal DNA carried by most people of European or Asian descent, which runs around 2% or higher. In the strictest genetic sense, the purest wild bison alive is actually less mixed than you are. But how did it get there? The contamination didn't come from a failure to protect the bison. It came from the act of saving it. The people responsible for saving the bison from extinction in the late 1800s were the very same people responsible for introducing cattle genetics into the species. They pulled it back from the edge with one hand and quietly rewired its future with the other. This single finding flipped the entire conservation field on its head. For decades, bison conservation was obsessed with purity, and herds were ranked by it. But geneticists like Oliver Ryder and Brian Davis pointed out a beautiful truth. Purity is a human idea. It is hard to square with the messy way real species actually develop. Hybridization is a normal engine of evolution, not an accident to be ashamed of. What the test exposed wasn't a contamination. It was an ancestral record of exactly how the species clawed its way through its narrowest moment alive. And this realization set the bison free. Because if this pure ideal was never quite real, the physical walls separating these herds could finally come down. Conservationists could now combine herds to build healthier, more genetically diverse populations. Exactly what a bottlenecked species needs. We are already seeing the incredible shift on the ground. In 2024, officials shortened the quarantine period for Yellowstone bulls, leaving the park from about a year and a half down to roughly 300 days, redirecting animals to tribal nations rather than slaughter. Since 2020, conservation partnerships have returned more than 2,300 buffalo to tribal nations. In early 2026, the largest single transfer recorded sent 213 animals to the Fort Peck Reservation, where the Assiniboine and Sioux tribes now manage hundreds of buffalo. Organizations like American Prairie have relocated over 500 bison while assembling a reserve of over 100,000 acres in Montana. And Yellowstone itself finally rewrote its rules, walking away from a political cap of 3,000 animals, now allowing the herd to range between 3,500 and 6,000. For the tribes of the Great Plains, bringing the herds home is a journey of healing. The buffalo has always been more than an animal. It is food, shelter, tool, and ceremony. The very center of a way of life the original slaughter was built to destroy. The Intertribal Buffalo Council treats every transfer as a restoration in far more than just an ecological sense. Inside Yellowstone today, something incredibly fitting has happened. Those two ancestral lines that scientists tracked as separate groups for 120 years, the indigenous survivors and the Montana newcomers, have quietly merged. They now move and breed across the park as one single, unified herd. So, is the Yellowstone bison the purest wild bison on Earth, 99.7% untouched? That claim was true and false at the very same time. And the narrow gap between the two holds the entire history of the species. That tiny trace of cattle DNA isn't a stain on the story. It is the fingerprint of the rescue itself. It is the permanent proof that 23 survivors, 21 outsiders, and a handful of stubborn, unrecognized people dragged an entire species back from the edge of nothing. And the saving left a mark that never washed out. If you love stories where science quietly overturns everything we thought we knew about the natural world, make sure to like, subscribe, and stick around. We will see you in the next one.